Good afternoon and welcome to this TDAG meeting. It's a pleasure to have everybody here today. TDAG is the Trees and Design Action Group. So we are a charity and a network that brings together individuals, professionals, academics and organisations from wide-ranging disciplines in both public and private sectors to improve the knowledge and good practice to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration, planning, design, construction and management of our urban places. In events like this today, we provide a forum for cross-sector working, and we also have business meetings, we respond to policy consultations, and we discuss topical issues. The community, so if you want to contribute anything, just email Sue and I at any point. So today we are launching a short guide produced by TDAG. It's called First Steps in Trees and New Developments. Just doing a spot of muting. First steps in trees and new developments. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by three excellent contributors. We have Anne, Vasily and Irina, and I'll let them introduce themselves in due course. We're also joined by Sue James, who is the absolute driving force behind TDAG and our knowledge exchange events, both with TDAG and also at Future Build and other places too. So before we kick off, I just wanted to mention some housekeeping. The meeting is recorded. If you have any questions at any point, just put them into the chat. And we have three presenters, and after each presentation, there will be the opportunity to ask quick questions before we have a longer discussion at the end. It's really nice if you can be involved in the question asking. So if you want to turn on your question to ask a question or to take part in the discussion at the end, please do. And myself and Sue will be manning the chat. So who am I? My name is Emma Franti. I work in the School of Engineering at the University of Birmingham. I'm the chair for today. I'm in civil engineering, but I'm a geographer by training. And I guess my specialism is understanding the impact of weather and climate on infrastructure, climate adaptation and air quality. The reason I'm involved in TDAG is because academics tell the world that nature-based solutions are what we need in our cities. And I thought it was really important to understand a little bit more about the practicalities of keeping trees alive and working with those in our urban areas. So over the last few years, we've funded a few different Trees and Design Action Group guides, one of which is First Steps in Trees and New Developments, which we're talking about today. I should mention that this guide was funded by Research England money awarded to the University of Birmingham, and the development of the guide was led by Anne and Sue and myself. It's also important to acknowledge that this guide came from a conversation with the TDAG network, which started as a conversation that led to a one-page document, and then we were able to secure funding to turn it into a guide. So that's why it's really important, if you do have good ideas or you want to tell us anything, that you get in touch. So I think that's more than enough from me. So I would like to hand over to Anne, who will tell you more about herself and the guides. Anne, are you good to go?
I'm good to go. Yes.
Awesome. I will stop talking. Over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Anne. I lead on the writing and research and writing of a lot of the TDAG guidance. My background, I'm an urban planner and usually did a lot of geography. And as an urban planner, straight away after graduating, I fell in the soup of, if I can use that image, of designing and planning and thinking about nature as a way, and natural systems as a way to make cities and places work better. I worked with that mindset. I discovered that mindset in the US, where I was for 7 years. And then I came over here, where for a little while, I'll work for the CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. And since Finland, I discovered CABE at that time, so a long time now ago, and I've since maintained the relationship. So I'm going to tell you a little bit. I want to share my screen so that you can have a look at what the document that we're launching today, so that you can see how it looks like. Here we go. And I want to tell you a little bit about the history of how this came about. That Emma alluded that it came through a discussion with the TDAG network, where there had been some discussions around how do we encourage better approaches to trees and in new development, especially in terms of avoiding tree loss and then securing good replacements. And we were looking at initially doing a very clear framework for having a very robust approach to replacement. And as we kept working on this and getting feedback on it, there was more and more comments around, well, but shouldn't we also address how to avoid finding ourselves in this place if it can be avoided, where perhaps there's greater value to be secured from preserving existing trees as much as possible, and sometimes building existing trees into design proposals. And then as time went, it became clear that there was a need for a very simple, approachable document highlighted what can be done to secure better outcomes from new developments from trees. We've done this at the same time when TDAG has embarked onto a very big project that is called Trees Planning and Development, a Guide for Delivery, developing a very comprehensive resource to tackle everything related to trees, planning and development. And this first step guide provided us an opportunity to release almost a form of an executive, very action-oriented executive summary. And that's what we've tried to do. So I guess if I can, there we go. I think in terms of our first discussion with the TDAG network and our choice to move away from a short guidance that would only promote good practice for mitigation, these are some of the arguments that we felt, okay, we perhaps in emphasizing how well one can deal with replacement, it might communicate wrongly the message that it's actually okay to keep replacing trees. It's a-okay, it will work out fine. Because the reality is, for any tree that's lost, the lag time, I mean, securing mitigation when it's really unavoidable that there's some loss is very important. And we do address that in detail in the very big guide that I mentioned with kind of thorough methods. But in this very short guide, we've moved the emphasis away, because really the lag time for, even with robust mitigation approaches, for really gaining equal benefits to what you had, is at least the time for the new planting to reach some form of maturity, which is at least 25 years from the point of planting. And also, might not be a desirable situation, but some studies shows, and this I've sourced from students who have recently done an urban forestry master's at Myers Coase, and I've endeavored to do some research in association with those master theses. So one was done in Essex, and in Essex there was within Essex Council there was quite, I think it's about 40 planning applications that were reviewed, that had been completed, and in that review, okay, it's in one locality, but it's I don't think it's a local authority that's necessarily worse than any other. It was found that there was nearly 60% of all newly planted trees in residential setting that did not survive within 5 years. So while there might have been a good tree loss replacement mitigation strategies that was agreed, in terms of securing the survival of any new tree planted, whether it's new trees for replacement or just purely newly planted trees for local enhancement, then the chances of survival at the moment are very poor. And then it's also about considering cumulative impacts. This figure, the last and third figure on that screen, comes from work that has been done again by a master's student in Bristol, considering that in terms of allowing progressive removal of trees within the urban fabric, within the range of 3 years, what the student has found was that 40% of existing tree found on development sites in Bristol where we moved. So the cumulative impact of even a small amount of removal at a time through development can be quite significant, quite amount to something significant. So we thought, all right, tree replacement is a very important topic, but let's focus on the bigger picture of how to secure retention and how to manage unavoidable loss, and then also how to secure canopy expansion from new development, and what can be done, what can developers do, but also what local planning authorities do. And so we've identified 3 very simple principles, and around those 3 principles, which I'm going to present to you now, we've highlighted, okay, what does it mean practically? And there's a range of actions that we've highlighted. And we've color-coded those actions based on when they take place in relationship to the planning application process. Do they take place before applying for planning consent or before any planning application comes for consent? And that's an orange dot. Do they take place, do they need to take place at the time of application? That's red. Or after, once consent has been secured. And that's the blue dot. And then finally, there's some things that can be done anytime, and that's the green dot. So going into our first principle is understand. And what we try to highlight there is that no design work, however conceptual, should start until the 3 constraints associated with a development site are well understood. The reason for this is quite a common sense one. It's really about saving time and money. And the earlier those constraints are integrated into a project, the greater the ability is going to be to cost effectively achieve very good outcome and a mutually beneficiary relationship between the built structures and the trees. So this translates practically into, for developers, the actions here, and there are actions that are before applying for consent. It's about appointing an arboricultural consultant at the outset with scope to contribute to not just doing a survey, but also to contribute to the iteration of the design process. Because often, with a little bit of arboricultural guidance, there are ways to think creatively and to really understand what can be done and what cannot, even when we move from very early concept to more detailed design. Secondly, to ensure that findings from the tree survey and the tree constraints plans that becomes associated with the tree survey, that work really informs feasibility studies. And so that really one doesn't have unrealistic expectation of what can be done. And lastly, also making sure that key local policies affecting trees in development also inform feasibility. For instance, is there a required approach in the local plan, the development management policy for mitigation? Is there a policy related to a requirement, for instance, of achieving a defined quantum of canopy cover, as is the case currently in some councils, not many? Is there a green area ratio that has to be met for the site? Those constraints have to be understood up front. And then for the local planning authority, then action that are useful to take to make sure design work from the applicant standpoint or new development don't happen in a vacuum is, well, to have an adopted strategy so that planning officers or tree officers working within a planning and department have an understanding of the wider context within which each development takes place in terms of current provision and needs for trees and priorities in terms of how much needs to be provided, what for. Secondly, ensuring, and this has to be taking place before planning applications come in, that ensuring that all land allocated for development undergoes some form of arboricultural assessment, so that the tree asset, the vegetation asset that needs, that warrant protections are identified. When I've spoken to some developers, they hate when a TPO is placed on trees within a site within which they're just putting an application forward for, because it changes the rules of the game as the game has already started. And so being able to identify what needs protection, especially on those big, key, important sites, is really important. And thirdly, the last action is to possibly, alongside what's quite routine now, to in terms of the requirements that are embedded into the validation process, which local authorities have the ability to define, alongside the requirements for the tree survey, to possibly consider if it makes sense with the local policy setting to require a systematic measuring of canopy cover, so that the impact on canopy cover is understood, and also possibly to embed the use of CAVAT, the capital asset valuation method for amenity trees, i.e. to estimate the amenity value of trees found on site, as being done currently. For instance, Camden Council systematically require for local applicants to run CAVAT, so to conduct evaluation of the existing tree stock, the tree population within all development sites within the council. What's the impact of that? Well, it allows us to look at the impact development has on trees, not just from the categorization that's provided in the BS, i.e. category A, B, or C trees, but also from a more wider perspective, and one that translates into pound figures, which I think has a more impact in terms of portraying the value of those trees. And it also offers much greater potential for when one then looks at mitigation, to say, well, this is what we're losing. We need to find mitigation for that value and replace that value. Now here's the extracts from the Camden local plan. You can see here that at the top, the paragraph 6.8 of the local plan set out that the council will require a suitable replacement, providing at least or equal amenity and ecological value. And then in the SPD that is associated with the local plan, specifically on trees and development, it articulates how this is going to be delivered, needs to be delivered, with all sites to be submitted, of course, to a tree survey, but that the findings from this survey need to be used for estimating the value of on-site trees using CAVAT. And then if loss takes place, and if equal replacement cannot be provided, then funding from off-site contributions needs to take place based on that amenity value that has been calculated. So you can see here we have a very powerful mechanism in terms of approach to mitigation. Now, And that can only take place if one understands the value in the first place. So securing that very thorough understanding is critical. So now the second principle our first step guide is structured around is the principle of retention, retain, and making the successful retention of existing healthy mature trees a strong priority. The benefits of that is, of course, I mean, from a developer perspective, to increase prospect of securing planning consent. For everybody's perspective, whether it's a developer or even for, obviously, for the council, is to maximize the appeal of future development, appeal to existing communities, and to future communities who will live in that development. And lastly, from going back to more of a developer-centric perspective, is to also the benefit is to reduce the amount of effort that might be needed to achieve local policy targets. And I'm in particular thinking of biodiversity net gain, which is now coming into action. So actions for developers here. Well, firstly, when proposing significant removals or works near protected trees, we strongly encourage developers to use pre-application advice to review the tree constraints plan, the proposed tree removal plan, and possibly an indicative tree protection plan when there is one. Just to avoid any surprises and to ensure that there's a shared understanding of the tree impact that a development might have. Now, when finalizing a planning application, one wants also to develop a tree protection plan and the associated arboricultural method statement iteratively, adding and developing the plan as detailed design progresses. When speaking with arboricultural consultants, they often say, well, we aren't often engaged enough in the iteration of design to really sometimes size all the opportunities to find cost-effective ways to do things. And so that iterative process and making sure the arboricultural consultant is really an integral part of the design team is really important. An arboricultural method statement isn't something that's done once and for all. It is something that really needs to evolve as the design progresses for it to be effective. And then once planning consent's been secured, the arboricultural consultant, whether it's the one that's been involved so far or if it's somebody else, but arboricultural skills are still needed, especially for monitoring tree protection during construction. And that starts with a pre-commencement meeting with the LPA before any construction, including excavation, starts. And that really, the last action here goes really sort of the second to last action here goes along those lines, and in the sense of one of the goals is to make sure site operatives are briefed on tree protection and highlighting good practices to be adhered to, but also making sure that that information is not only captured in writing in the documents that are actually used on site, such as the construction management plan. I don't think the arboricultural method statement will not be used on site. The construction management plan will. And also using visuals. And there's a range of resources that exist, often developed by consultants, that some freely available, that are available for everybody to use. And that is worth really tapping into. And a last thing is to consider also the most sustainable when tree loss occurs is to look at the timber resources that result from that as a resource, as something that can be used either to create play feature, artistic features, or simply being wood chips. So there's a resource there that's worth trying to reinvest in the site. Actions for local planning authorities. Well, local planning authorities are very strained for resources, and monitoring condition and the enforcement teams have a really tough job on their hands. However, it is possible in writing condition well to put the burden of monitoring largely onto the developer team by imposing monitoring condition on the implementation of agreed tree protection measures, and on really making sure to not, there's a lot of pressure to sign off conditions, but that's where the local authority holds power in terms of implementation of what was agreed. So it is really essential not to sign off monitoring conditions until its services has received all the satisfactory evidence that the tree protection plan called for. There's also a need to ensure that, I would say, ahead of that, planning enforcement policies prioritize the prevention of tree breaches, and that a temporary stop notice can be issued quickly when needed. The devolution of authorities has to be thought through so that it's practical for a tree officer and expedient to serve a notice when it's needed. And that is really, some of local authorities perform really well. I've even interviewed local authorities where there's such a trust and such a shared understanding of what will be done and when in terms of scenarios, that the local authority, the tree officer, literally drives around with pre-signed blank stop notices in his car. And there are other places where only the director of planning can co-sign a temporary stop notice, which means the chances of this person being available when a notice would need to be signed, and there's no trust in the fact that the officer, tree officer, would make the right decision in calling and wanting a development work to stop. So I think there's great scope within the local authority landscape, I would say, to enhance approaches to enforcement at the policy level and in terms of organizational culture and on this. And then those who have been using temporary stop notices, who have a culture of using them without being afraid of the possible legal consequences and feeling they had the competency to make those judgment call well in terms of when to serve them. They've also shared with me that it's very useful in the usually very rare instances where a stop notice is served. It's useful to talk about it to the local press because it helps to get the word out that this happened. And it's a fantastic deterrent for things, to avoid things going that bad another time on another project. Now, in those places that have used stop notices, that tell me, well, now just the threat of, or we're going to need to serve a stop notice if this doesn't stop, isn't remedied immediately, just is enough for things to be remedied. Another very important action to take for LPAs is to have a very robust tree replacement policy, so that mitigation isn't on a one tree loss, then we require one tree to replace that, but is on a like-for-like basis in terms of benefits whether those benefits are measured using a proxy like canopy cover, or whether it's actually measured with a focus on benefit, and some places are using carbon, for instance. It is very important to have tree preservation orders on trees that are being planted as part of mitigation measures, so that in the future they are replaced should they fail. And then lastly, when commuted sum payments are collected for off-site mitigation, the focus should be on financing new planting sites rather than routine replacement, so that indeed there's loss mitigation that's happening, as opposed to replacing existing trees within the public domain that should be replaced and aren't. Now, oops, sorry about that. Now the last, I'm not sure what happened there. The last principle is around enhance. And the idea is to seek to enhance the extent and resilience of the canopy cover of each site. Benefits, I've lost that slide. I think I did a little change and I lost my slide when I was preparing for this. The benefits are really to get more attractive, new attractive sites, new attractive developments, to also satisfy, as previously, with other requirements that might fall upon developers, including net gain. And here, actions for developers is to really actively pursue species diversification and think very thoroughly about suitability to the site conditions in their species choice, and wherever possible to prioritize large canopy trees where the site geometry allows for it, whether it's in terms of growing condition, underground condition, and above ground condition. And of course, the TDAG guide on species condition is a fantastic resource now for everyone to tap into to secure better species choice and to diversify what's being planted. And here we're, of course, thinking of responding to the imperative of posed upon us by climate change, and securing trees take at least 30 years to achieve maturity and then have a lifespan from 60, 80 years for the short-leaved trees to a couple hundred years for the longest-leaved trees. And the climate will be very different in either of these scenarios. So that species choice is now more than ever a really fundamental question. Then the second consideration is to really ensure that both existing and new trees have a suitable growing environment with, whenever possible, continuous rooting trenches, load-bearing media when it's needed, when the surfaces located around the trees are going to bear load, then trees need those load-bearing growing media to have a chance to fulfill their growth potential. Otherwise, they're completely asphyxiated. There's a need to equally secure good access to stormwater runoff. And both BS 8545 2014 on the one hand, and trees in hard landscape are great resources to make good choices on all those design elements. And I'd like to reemphasize that we highlight the need to think about that both for new tree planting, but also there's a lot of opportunity and often something that's quite overlooked to enhance the growing media of existing tree, because the canopy growth potential is very significant on existing tree. And that's something that can be supported through enhancement to the growing environment. Then thirdly is to mandate the use of quality tree stock. And again, the BS 8545 provide good resources to write better specification and to here also demanding plant health passport to avoid any biosecurity issues. And lastly, something that's really often overlooked is to plan and sufficiently resource post-planting care for 3 to 5 years post-planting, as detailed in the BS. Actions for LPAs, there's 3 of them. We encourage LPAs to embed into local development management policies and design codes some quantitative targets on the expected canopy contribution of individual sites to the greater whole. Secondly, an integrated approach to trees and sustainable drainage, especially with, we've seen the weather this year in terms of the extent of the drought. This is expected to be becoming more and more frequent. The impact on tree health is significant, and making sure existing or available water resources and precipitation do infiltrate into the ground because instead of being drained into a combined sewer is really important. And thirdly, local development management policies need to be specific in terms of the planting specification to be used for trees in hard landscapes, so that indeed when load-bearing growing media need to go in, they are putting as a matter of a requirement. We encourage local planning authorities to enforce landscaping condition and to consider for sensitive operation to use bonds. This is a topic which in the forthcoming much more consistent bigger guide, trees planning and development, we will try to expand upon and illustrate with examples. And thirdly, we invite local planning authorities to identify and maintain up-to-date records of prospective public realm planting sites, so that when community sums become available, and everything in these first steps invites the creation of a policy setting where there is the opportunity to generate commuted sums, then the local authorities know where planting can take place. I've interviewed countless tree officers who tell me either we've been given a grant and all the politicians want us to plant so many thousand trees, but we don't know where to plant them. Or even we have plannings coming to us and we have these Section 106 monies, but we don't know where to plant. It's not that there's no need, but we just don't know where it's possible. So working with planning, often as part of the local plan, as our either update or development process, to fund some work on identifying plantable and space suitable for planting is a really worthwhile investment to get a good system going. Now, I'd like to give some examples of some of those policies that can be embedded in the local plan to provide a clear target on the tree outcome to be secured from development. One example is here. It's a French example. It comes from Greater Lyon in France, where there is a requirement for, you could say it's a greening ratio, but it is at ground level and nothing can be built underneath. So you cannot have a basement. It cannot be podium planting. So there's a requirement within certain areas. So this isn't for the densest part of town. It's not for the CBD, but for most of the urban areas, there's this ratio that is required, and it how high it is depends on the location. And they call it a planting ground ratio to really emphasize that it's planting in the ground. And so there's a minimum surface area that needs to be, that's a ratio of the overall surface of the development site. And there's a range of specification that goes alongside of that. There's minimum dimension. So I think any of such planting areas that count towards that planting ground needs to be at least 4 meters. Its minimum dimension has to be 4 meters. So the width, it cannot be a little 1 foot strip that wouldn't, along a building, that wouldn't qualify. It must be used for stormwater infiltration. If it isn't connected to, if it's not used for stormwater infiltration, again, it doesn't count. It must be planted, as much as context permits, with a 3 strata of vegetation, but for every 50 square meters of planting ground provided, at least 1 tree needs to go in. And while footpaths are allowed within that planting ground area, those footpaths have to be permeable, and their footprint is removed from the calculation. So that's one approach. And another approach that I've come across that's here, that comes from England, is the work that's been done in Wickham, and very recently Cornwall Council has adopted something virtually identical. So in Wickham, which is now part of Buckinghamshire, the local plan requires a minimum canopy cover target for all development sites outside town centers, and there's a map that shows where town centers are. All development sites that are greater than half a hectare, to provide a 25% canopy cover, regardless of what's there before. And yeah, that's the area of the policy DM34, if you're interested in looking into it. And there's SPD, a supplementary planning document that supports the implementation of this, within which applicants find a framework for calculating existing canopy cover, and then for calculating what will remain, taking into account trees to be removed, and what will be there within, I think, 20 years, given what is being proposed for planting. And there's, I think, over 300 species that are built in within the spreadsheet, as well as it takes into account, in terms of growth potential, the soil volume that's provided for those trees being planted. So there's quite a robust methodology that applicants have to use in order to calculate both their retained canopy cover and the new canopy cover that they're providing, to demonstrate how the 25% canopy cover target will be reached. And in our first step guide, we provide a case study that illustrates this policy and how it has been worked out around this development in High Wycombe, along Clay Lane, a residential development, where the target was met through having an on-site woodland, as you see here, as well as a series of large canopy growing trees. Those are the trees that are in yellow, through also retention of existing trees. Those are the trees that are in the very dark green. And what was interesting was that when discussing with the developer and their design team, the landscape architect who worked on this said that, one, it was the first time it wasn't the first time that the concept of canopy cover had been put to him as a landscape architect working on behalf of a developer on a development site. But it was the first time that a methodology for calculating canopy cover was provided to him. And he found that that was incredibly very helpful, because otherwise it remained a very vague concept to work with. And it was also having the figure, the 25% target to reach, pushed him and his colleagues to, so far they were working with, I would say, quite a blanket approach to implementing the NHSBC standards in terms of minimum distance for trees, regardless of the actual soil profile and risk for subsidence. And as a result of having to meet the requirements, it's challenged them to look a lot more closely as where constraints really laid in terms of proximity of building to trees, and where could buildings actually be really much more integrated to the built structure. And I found that was an interesting comment. So have a look at the first guide. If you want more detail on that case study, you'll see there's more details there. And that's it for me now. Thank you for your attention, and please ask me any question.
I'm the secretary of the Bristol Tree Forum, and I'm just going to give you a little introduction to the Tree Forum. It was set up in 2008 to encourage community engagement in tree management decisions, both on a local scale, i.e. individual decisions, but more importantly, the kind of much larger policy decisions. If you want, after this call, have a look at our website, and we have a blog and a social media presence. And as well, we have a sister site called Trees of Bristol, which has mapped all Bristol's trees and can be used to analyze, for example, tree cover in different bits of Bristol. We can show that there is, on the whole, there's lower tree cover in the more disadvantaged areas, etc. And some of the history of the Bristol Tree Forum is included in this paper that I wrote for the ARB Journal, which I can send on to anyone who wants after this discussion. So Bristol doesn't have a tree strategy, but it has a number of planning policies, which I want to quickly run through. We have local green planning policy BCS 9, which says individual green assets should be retained. Another policy that says all new development should integrate important existing trees. And then with much fanfare, we developed the Bristol Tree Replacement Standard, which was kind of seen as a good thing, in that if trees were removed, they were replaced often on more than a one-to-one basis. So much larger trees would require up to 7 replacements, and smaller trees only 1. But unfortunately, it seems to have been used to simply justify the removal of trees on development sites, because we're all told, look, it doesn't matter, they're going to be replaced. And then nationally, we're, I suppose, looking at the NPPF mitigation hierarchy, which is a kind of cascading decision process, in that you don't move on to the next step until you've tried the first. So the first is obviously avoid tree loss, and then it goes right through the others to compensate. But unfortunately, here in Bristol, we go straight to that last stage on pretty much every site. And the pressure to build houses, regardless, seems to override all other planning policies in Bristol. And we're losing large form trees all over Bristol.
That's silly. Are you sharing slides? Because I can only see your introductory slide at the moment. Did you hope to move on to slide 2 or 3?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Apologies. Is that now working?
No, we can just see your title slide.
Okay, sorry. Okay.
Oh, I can. We can see it now. Don't do anything.
Yeah.
Planning policies.
Yeah,
Okay.
so that's the slide I've just talked about, all the planning policies. And so, as I said, the pressure seems to be very, very high to build houses regardless. And I think in Bristol, the policy tends to be to just simply flatten the development site before you start. And I'd like to show you now a few examples, and I hope these will work. So south of Bristol, the south bit of Bristol, there's a lot of pressure to build on green spaces of various kinds. And here's an example of a green space with a load of trees, where it would have been very easy to build the housing around the existing trees. But as you can see, they were all simply removed before the building process started. So this is a large development, but it's typical of many other large developments in Bristol. Newfoundland Road. This is a development which is right next to the motorway that brings all the traffic into Bristol. So these houses that were built overlooking the M32 motorway, and the screening that was originally put in place before the houses were built was obviously immediately removed in an early part of the development process. To give you another example, again, this is just leading off the motorway. This is a very polluted area. The left-hand slide shows a number of trees, Norway maples that were on the very edge of the development site, and possibly not even on the development site itself. It's more likely that they were on land that was owned by the council rather than the developer. These trees all had TPOs, but regardless, permission was given to remove them. And unfortunately, this is how the site now looks. A number of other trees were also removed, in fact, between this development site and the next. So you're seeing essentially an area with quite a lot of canopy, that had quite a lot of canopy 5 years ago, but now has none. Sometimes fortuitously, the trees are all in lines. So this is a car park, obviously, which is being redeveloped for housing. It would have been trivial to build the new houses round the existing trees, but the decision once again was taken to remove all the trees. So I guess our interest in Bristol is to somehow change the culture. We provide detailed comments on important planning applications, but I feel that we're kind of failing in that by the time we've got to the point of a formal application, it's too late. The momentum is too great, and councillors who are on planning committees feel as though they have to say yes to things once they've got to the stage of a formal application. I think it's fair to say that planning committee members are sort of kept in the dark in a way as to Bristol's green planning policies, and we struggle to make them aware of the policies that Bristol has. And we're also somehow trying to make them aware of the opportunities to build better by retaining existing trees. I think it's fair to say that fighting to retain existing trees is controversial, and it can be pretty unpopular to get into those kind of conflicts. And most people in Bristol and perhaps elsewhere prefer to focus on planting new trees and not try and retain existing trees. We've tried to put these ideas together in various blogs and tweets and what have you. Here's an image, in fact, which came from TDAG. It shows the kinds of things that can be done but aren't being done in Bristol. I'm not sure these blogs have had much influence. And I think our questions really are really quite fundamental, and it's really got to the point where we wonder why some local planning authorities require developers to build around existing trees but not others. And how do you change the culture within a local planning authority? So the kind of negotiations that happened over the buildings in Islington and Oxford that feature in TDAG guides, how do you make those kind of negotiations happen within your local planning authority? In essence, we have a lot of the policy we need, but it's proved impossible to get that policy implemented. And I think that's a pretty big question for us. I think another question from our point of view is really whether the BS 5837 trees and construction standard, whether the tree categorization is still fit for purpose in the climate emergency. So in an urban situation, it's quite hard to find perfect trees. And yet the trees that might be, you know, B, C, or possibly even U category will still provide shade and other benefits. And maybe we need to think about ways of categorizing trees which encourages their retention, because we're seeing on most of our development sites, most of the trees are being kind of given pretty low kind of categorizations, and that doesn't help in any arguments to retain them. I think our next big question is, can we gather more case studies of good examples of residential housing? And we've just seen the one from Wickham. Many of the TDAG examples show really wonderful things that have been done with commercial buildings. And I think we're really struggling a bit to show the local planning authority and also councillors on planning committees good examples of residential housing and retained trees. I don't think we've got any real examples in Bristol because, as you can see from the previous slides, most things are simply flattened. I think we have another question about housing density, and is it possible to build up rather than building out? Is it possible to group car parking and actually retain the same housing density and still retain trees? And I think a big question for us is, what are the additional costs of doing this? Obviously, the cheapest thing is always to flatten the site and then pop a few trees in afterwards. So what is the additional costs? And also, is the housing that results from that then more valuable? So is there a cost and then a benefit? And I guess the final question, which has sort of been discussed already, is the issue of foundations and how practical it is to build next to large existing trees and what needs to be done to resolve that. So in conclusion, basically, I think, as we all know, retaining existing trees brings immediate benefits. But so far, we haven't really managed to get that point across in Bristol. We don't know if we're an outlier here, but I guess many other local authorities are kind of in the same position. And I think our problem is one of trying to explain these really basic things to the planning authority and the councillors who are on planning committees. Thank you very much.
So just sort of to reflect the previous sort of conversations, we don't unfortunately operate in cities. We are a developer that's got 22 businesses across the country, so we do developments all around UK and in Scotland and in Wales, and the only urban schemes that we do very seldomly these days is London. So unfortunately I can't claim any responsibility for the loss of trees in Bristol, but just so that everyone's aware, and what I'm going to try and focus everyone's attention is that we are actually very focused on creating good green infrastructure, creating good developments based on the existing infrastructure, connecting into the existing networks, etc., etc., or such is our policy internally. So without much sort of discussion about what happened previously, obviously trees have been mentioned as a fundamental important part of public realm since the responsive environments. There's a couple of images there, some images from the National Design Guide, etc., etc. And we do work very much with references to the national policy, such as National Design Guide, Building for Healthy Life, where where all schemes kind of go through that assessment, working with the existing, retaining the existing features with topography, levels, planting, etc. That is the site offerings. So I very much hope that in a lot of cases we are on the right track. Just before I go into our best practice, can anybody still see things I'm showing here, or is it too small a scale?
For me, it's okay.
So basically we do, well, I am an urban designer working at group level at Taylor Wimpey. So one of my fundamental principal missions is to make sure that we deliver quality placemaking, landscaping, etc. So we do produce a lot of in-house guidance for bettering our environments, for the environment, for our customers, etc., etc. And here you can see a selection of a variety of guidances, from creating streets to detailing the place and how to create good streetscape, how to plot most efficiently and for the benefit of quality, again, of realm, and a guide to green infrastructure, which is one of our sort of fundamental guides as to how deliver tree planting and generally green infrastructure on site. So we do understand that greenery achieves better quality places, better value and reduced costs, better sales performance, which is important for us, well integrated developments that provide safe and accessible space for all, quick, more easily implemented planning consents, hopefully, and then kind of our corporate social responsibility to reduce the environmental impact of developments and mitigate climate change, and create environments that encourage residents to adopt healthy lifestyle, because all of those issues are quite important. So obviously tree planting as well as green infrastructure is absolutely paramount for quality placemaking, and it kind of aids welcoming and makes our places adaptable, safe and pleasant, distinctive, because obviously going back to retention of trees, it's very, very important. And they do immediately create very memorable and distinct places, legible, healthy, etc. So trees are the benefit of creating attractive, healthy and legible places for our customers. And we very much hope that all our businesses are using that as a kind of fundamental guide. So we do have a certain strategy how to approach quality green infrastructure and landscaping, and how to get involved with all disciplines up front, starting with various site surveys and policies reviews, opportunity and constraints, character analysis, and involve the bioculturalists and ecologists and planners and engineers, etc., etc. So that's the sort of principal strategy that we promote across the business. Now, whether that that happens smoothly and consistently, of course, is quite another matter. So we kind of want our landscaping to be multifunctional, connected, technically competent, distinctive, environmentally responsible, biodiversity friendly. We pay a lot of attention to sustainability and biodiversity enhancements, accessible and safe, attractive, highly impact, and robust and long-lived. So that's kind of very, very important on so many levels. Just a couple of words about myself. 20 years ago, I was working for English Partnerships, which was obviously a government agency, where achieving all those things was never an issue, because it was sort of we were sort of that pioneering organization that promoted quality infrastructure, and our business model was to deliver good infrastructure up front, including landscaping, etc. And I was really quite surprised when I left and confronted the real world, how much more difficult it all proved to be. When I first started working for a developer as an in-house designer, and we went to the local authority and presented them fantastic proposals with a park, boulevard planted trees, with parking bays and different materials, etc. We were told, no, we don't want trees, we don't want parking bays, we don't want anything that is too difficult to maintain. So that's kind of was the first learning curve of how we can actually, that there is an issue there, and I think the issue is still there. Something is not quite reconciled to this day. We do assess our sites in terms of their performance. We do assess our sites in terms of their performance as professionals, in-house, with homeowners. We do post-occupancy research of our sites to see how happy or unhappy our customers are. And we also review the sort of landscaping and tree planting performances sometimes. And obviously, as I said earlier on, while the aspiration is high, the results are often patchy. However, the sort of top performing sites are more or less consistently performing well with everybody and in every sort of assessment, at every assessment opportunity. Like, for example, one of our best sites, Church Fields and Boston Spa, is an excellent example of how the scheme is integrated into the existing landscape, how we managed to create species-rich grassland and wildflower meadows, and plant the appropriate trees and maintain the woodland and maintain all the existing trees and work with the existing. That is indeed a very, very good scheme and a fantastic example of how things could be done. And then unfortunately we too do some very poor sites where there's not absolutely nothing interesting happening in terms of landscaping, where the trees are not local. Particularly sales centres are very good at planting spiky plants instead of the appropriate species. A lot of the time trees fail and non-native planting doesn't really fit the purpose. So we're kind of keeping an eye on those things and trying to promote a more sustainable approach. So here are some examples from our sites, which I think highlight that retaining existing mature trees can actually make the scheme work and really add value to and quality to the developments. So these are some of our sites from around Manchester on top, for example, Halfpenny Meadows. The whole entire hedgerow with mature oak trees, and the central cluster of oak trees was made into a central focal point, and the sort of cycle route along the existing hedgerow, and every single tree on site is retained and also enhanced by additional planting. So I would say that we do have some very, very successful solutions. A couple of schemes at the bottom where, again, the existing mature trees literally structure the development. Labourne Chase, and another scheme in Sheffield where a whole entire botanical garden was introduced into a scheme, and the buildings were actually designed around the existing trees and other features such as ancient walls, etc., etc. So I think if anybody's interested, as a good example of how things can be done, that will be actually quite a positive example. So again, more trees working together with a grouping of buildings. Camborne, where we managed to achieve a lovely tree planted boulevard, was actually a subsystem integrated into the green verges, the image to the left. And then the central image is the former hospital site in Colchester, Westbourne Park, which actually is also a fantastic example of how every species of existing trees was retained, and also some of the original structures for the previous owners, for the previous occupants, like rest pavilions, etc., etc. So the scheme is full of character, just simply due to the retention of spaces, trees, and some existing pavilions. And again, some other schemes at the bottom. To the right is a scheme near Manchester in Winslow, where everything is based around a network of existing mature oak trees. So here is a bit of a here is some idea that not all is that bad with the developer's approach. So at times we're quite successful in creating tree planted boulevards. I've already shown the Camborne example and some examples from Southeast. Unfortunately, not always do we manage to plant the right species in the right place, like a couple of sales centers here with very different solution. And it just shows, I think, the importance of appropriate approach to tree planting and landscaping, full stop. Now, not all this is also a success story. As I mentioned earlier on, some trees don't survive. Now, whether this is due to our incompetency or whether it's something else, some other, because the process is so vast and so complicated, anything could happen at any moment. And different businesses have different issues as we move along. An example of what would have been a fantastic boulevard street on the top image there, but something broke down completely at the adoption stage. Something didn't quite work out between the planning and adoption and highways issues there. So the boulevard just has green verges and nothing else. And also some other issues at the image there where not all tree planting happened according to plan. So this is something we're trying to focus on and trying to understand why not all our schemes work that well. Well, the number one observation, I'd say, and I think somebody mentioned the kind of the land purchase stage. One of the main issues is the kind of other stakeholders involved in the development. It always works better, as all the previous schemes I've shown you, when either the landowners are particularly interested in leaving a proud legacy, or there are some other influential stakeholders involved, like HCA or Homes England, or when the landowners are so keen on creating something good that they're actually prepared to participate in the design process and also discount the purchase of the land, because indeed, as one of my colleagues says sometimes jokingly, we are in the business of making a lot of farmers very, very rich, because indeed the land is sort of the cost of the land is the fundamental expense there. So here's a couple more examples of where the kind of the planting and the tree planting was successful and where not. The schemes above are from Great Western Park in Oxfordshire, and I don't even know where the images at the bottom came from. I just don't remember because they were so incredibly unsightly. Now, I went on to Google Map to see if one of those boulevards I looked at has actually improved. Unfortunately not, and I'll sort of focus a little bit on what exactly the issues potentially can be, that the trees are not planted. And here I just couldn't resist to imagine that that boulevard with trees planting along it. So some of the feedback I keep getting from our business units as to why not all our schemes are as successful. And a lot of them come from the technical issues, and as I mentioned earlier on, like for example, some authorities demand street lights to be offset 10 meters from every planted tree on the street. Then obviously utility drainage and services at times interfere quite significantly, as well as connections to the private plots, which sometimes don't even coincide with the drives and go onto the green verges. So that can be very confusing. And the verges can be too small, and there's just too many thick concrete curves prohibit from planting successfully. Visibility displays, that's highway's favorite, as in so many times the trees are not desirable because they're deemed to be obscuring the views. Visitor parking bays on street. And that was probably the result of not planting the trees at one of the previous images, or the limited amount of trees, because those also at times prohibit from planting street trees. Local planning authorities, such as highways and adoption, or authorities in no agreement, that can also result in some kind of breakdown in communication between different departments. Urban creep actually is quite a significant impact on street tree planting, because I remember being denounced for boulevards in my previous job when we had a scheme. We delivered a really nice scheme in Letchworth, where we observed all the kind of Letchworth foundation parameters, the depth of the front gardens, the depth of the back gardens, the tree planted boulevards, and everything worked really well. But the residents complained that they didn't want any trees and they didn't want any gardens, they just wanted driveways. So often, and I can see it even around where I live, that people remove the trees for the benefit of parking, for example, especially if we try and plant trees in their own gardens, in the private gardens. So planting trees in private gardens would require 5-year maintenance that will not necessarily work with the sort of business model, because often by 5 years' time, all the plots are sold and the developers have moved out, or ourselves have moved out. So it's quite tricky to keep sort of maintaining back garden trees, for example. So of lately, very few developers plant trees in the back garden, as far as I know, And also the cost of mature trees. A lot of mature trees are actually imported, and Brexit didn't help at that stage. Sorry for mentioning that word. And then last but not least, as I said, if there's some sort of assistance there from other stakeholders, that's fine, but it's always very excessive commuted sums. For example, some of the pages from Oxfordshire Streetscape Guide, where landscaping within the highway corridor will need to be adopted. Private trees covered by license or adoption that are amended to create unadopted islands are not acceptable. So there's a lot of complication there. Even if we decide to create our own management company, for example, there's certain parts of streetscape that have to be adopted, and it's all a little bit tricky to create the kind of right ratio of adoption and management companies. So a few more statements from that street tree guidance. So care for 3 years after to ensure establishment, range of ages should be planted, canopies. I think we covered all these topics earlier on, and then all of those things, of course, ever so slightly contradict some of the money one has to pay. Now here is £10 per tree per item for 30 years plus 2,050 for replacement, and that's going back. That already, that this is like an extract from commuted sum calculation, again from Oxfordshire. So that implies that per tree, developers have to pay quite an amazing amount of money, and the replacement's already kind of predicted. That's going back to original to the document, where we shouldn't really expect the trees to fail, but that seems to be the problem. Now we go for all sorts of creative alternatives just to avoid adoption, which I don't think are as successful. Like in this instance, in the development in Wilmslow, all the trees are planted in private gardens or private spaces. And actually they're quite disputed spaces because they seem to be planted at the boundary of the conveyed boundaries, which is sort of another point of argument. If people don't pull them down for whatever reason, they may argue that they don't know who is responsible for the tree and who's going to maintain it. Other things that we're trying to do at the moment is sort of create half private garden, half management space, and plant the trees in that management space just to achieve street planting, because we do appreciate the benefits of tree planted streets. But this is also tricky because that sort of conveyance boundary becomes not very obvious and quite fuzzy, and there are other issues there at stake. So we're fully committed to creating the best possible landscaping, and we appreciate the green infrastructure ecosystem services that are the ecosystems that make human lives possible. We do understand all of that. We do strive to retain every single tree, every single hedge, every single greenery that exists on our sites, and we do create other things like parks and biodiversity offset and SANGs, etc., etc. So if anyone's interested, I can go into some further, more positive examples, but I wasn't entirely sure where should I pitch it. I guess just the fact that some of the technical adoption and financial issues here sometimes muddle the water. So I think this is more or less everything I wanted to say. Just a bit of a reassurance that developers do try to do their best. Certainly we do as best as we can.
Thank you ever so much, Irina. That was great. Another virtual clap from us all across the TDAG network. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm really pleased that you could speak today, Irina, because there was a bit of what I normally call planner bashing in the chat, but this time it was developer bashing. And I think there are lots of different people who work as developers, and not all of them are bad. So let's have a discussion. Does anybody have any specific questions for Anne or Irina or for Vasily about anything they've heard today? Because there's so much going on in the chat, it's been difficult to kind of pull out specific questions. So a hand up, Giovanna, off you go.
Yeah, thanks very much. They're really, really interesting, informative. All the presentations, fantastic. Thank you. I was just kind of really interested in, I'm part of the Haringey Tree Protectors. We're a campaign group set up in Haringey during COVID, just to let you know, in London. So we're all about protecting and preserving existing mature trees in our cities. Why are we talking about statute? I'm trying to get to the bottom of why developers, as far as I understand, in about 2012, the regulations around development and building were loosened to a certain extent by the coalition government, and they've been further loosened sort of by the current government. But why does there seem to be obsession with just kind of flatlining everything on a development site generally? I know obviously we've seen some really great examples of where it's not happening, but I'd say the general impression I'm guessing is that developers tend to just fell mature trees. They just kind of get rid of them. So I'm just wondering what the reasons are, you know, why is this happening so much? And you know, and we know that it's got to change, but why all three of you, why it's currently happening? And why is it being allowed to happen? Is it statute? Is it because it's cheaper to do it? Is it just easier to kind of get things dug down and the foundations laid when there's not lots of root systems going on? I'm just really interested in why it's happening, because I'm still a little bit unclear.
Thanks for your question, Giovanna. I wonder if either Anne wanted to respond to that based on her experience of speaking to people throughout the TDAG network, and also maybe Irina. Anne, I wonder if you wanted to go first, then Irina could just have a bit of a rest from talking for a couple of minutes.
Did I come across as I'm struggling?
No, I didn't want to imply that in the slide. Yeah. If I just talked for half an hour, I would have a dry thought.
Okay, it's okay. I was joking.
Anne, you're on mute.
With the overhaul of the planning system, indeed, and the introduction of the NPPF, which has had several iterations, initially, the concept of sustainable development, as it was introduced by the coalition government and then the conservative government, was equated with development viability. So development viability was placed front and center of the development process, and that's and it was a definition of what sustainable development is. Now, since that has been watered down, but development viability is really strongly embedded in the planning system. Now, overall, nobody will contest that if development is not viable, it will not take place. So you can't, you know, there's a reason why that's there. So that's the change of the planning system you were describing. And now, then in terms of removing flattening the site, there are some constraints, including felling license. That so there are some protection that exist, even if a tree isn't protected. If you reach a certain cubic meter of volume of wood you cut, then you should get a felling license. That regime is managed by the Forestry Commission. It has nothing to do with the planning system. And there was a very poor integration of the two regimes, and that has very recently been addressed. Now, it is more convenient for a developer and cheaper to develop a site that has zero constraint. And then when you speak with developers, you also, especially the more informed, the developers that have a real brand reputation they're working at establishing, those developers, you know, you have a range between very small house builder to bigger developers that have a reputation, a corporate social responsibility policy, an image, that the latter one, like Taylor Wimpey, they understand the impact it has on their product in terms of how fast they can sell, and how quick they get planning consent, how fast they can sell, and the better product with trees around and working around the constraints that tree create. You know, there's a return on that investment, but not everybody understands that mindset, and it is especially harder on small development site with smaller house builders, which don't necessarily have the same brand or reputation image, and have also much more constraints in terms of the viability of their development. So that's, I think, the context that exists. Put alongside of that, typically a very wishy-washy development management policy around trees, where development management policies say development shall endeavor, wherever possible, to retain existing trees and plant new trees. That provides a very loose framework to operate within. This is why within TDAG, we're really pushing for local authority to set very clear quantitative targets. One of the things that has come out very strongly from the interviews I've been conducted for trees planning and development is that what cannot be quantified doesn't get accounted for in terms of land purchase, and that once those quantum and those targets are set, it provides a much more level playing field and clear landscape for, as in clear framework for a developer to plan its development within. Now, whether the target is always systematically met or not, and whether in some, that's how much the system falls down after that, that's a separate question. But if you have a clear bar that's set, it removes the weak, one of the weak places or the weak points in the system, which is, yes, viability is key. Yes, trees provide constraints, and if then there's very loose understanding of what tree outcome are expected, then it's the trees will be felled. And then with the felling regime that was managed by the Forestry Commission that was working so poorly. So there are things in the system that are improving, like the felling regime, and there are ways for local planning authority to be much clearer on tree outcomes. Now, having a good policy, as Bristol demonstrated, isn't necessarily the silver bullet, but without it, you're in a much worse position, from what I can gather from speaking to really many councils on this.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in here? That there's a lot of discussion in the chat about land value and the cost of land. Now, if we did have these clear tree and woodland strategies that were adopted that set out what's required, and hopefully Irina can come in on this, surely this would then influence the cost, because the developer would know exactly what they had to deliver, and there wouldn't be all that confusion, which then leads to all these viability debates.
I absolutely agree with you, Sue. And if everybody had the level playing field, and all of that has been incorporated in the sort of land purchase up front, then there wouldn't be an issue. I mean, it's difficult for me to think about, well, we do have some London schemes, but most of them are in places where there are no trees. They're like junctions and railway junctions and all sorts of other rather weird places that require remediation and more tree planting rather than removal of trees. But I can totally understand some developers, because it is so much easier to build on something, especially in the urban environment, where most of your character comes from architectural qualities, the kind of the massing, the detailing of the actual buildings and the streetscape. Well, for us, for example, with most of our developments being kind of on the edge, on the periphery, somewhere else, actually these constraints are fundamental, because these constraints actually dictate the solutions, because without retention of trees, there's absolutely nothing. There's absolutely nothing in what is a very suburban and pretty simple two maximum 3-story development. So, but yes, I absolutely agree with you that a lot of things need to be understood as to how they can be translated into the land value too. Yeah.
Thanks both. Mark, you have your question. Oh, Giovanna, did you want to come back on that?
Sorry, yeah, I just want to say that particularly where there was a development recently in a very sort of attractive part of sort of North London, Highgate, but like the trees that were felled were heritage. They were beautiful trees. So I mean, I think trees need to be seen as valuable as heritage buildings. We should be viewing you know, trees of a certain age as important as, and also the trees were on the peripheries of the site. So they were all along the edges. They weren't in the middle. They could have very easily be retained. I just think there is this kind of obsession with just like sanitizing it, like getting rid of everything. And I think, you know, until we get a change in statute that forces, you know, developers to change, you know, to actually make them, and also LAs, you know, I don't know how much LAs have to kind of, and they can make decisions on their own, whether they have to always think about what's the statute here, what's central government, you know, dictating here, or whether they have a certain amount of, you know, they can make sort of more proactive decisions, you know, relating to their own tree stock in their own areas, you know.
Tree local authorities, there is no country in the world that has better, like there are very little countries in the world that has as good a tree protection regime than the UK. Local authorities have complete tools they need to secure the tree protection that they deemed warranting protection.
Wow.
So it's about using it.
Yeah, about using it, exactly. So maybe not in Haringey. I'm not so sure about Haringey. I don't know if you.
But I do agree that local authorities have a lot of power, and if only they apply it, it's in their gift to actually ensure that quality is delivered. In my experience, certainly when there's a proactive local authority, not a reactive one, proactively promoting something, there's always the better result on the site, always.
Thanks ever so much for your contributions today, Giovanna. Mark, you've patiently had your hand up for a while. Would you like to come on in?
It was just sharing some observations which agreed but shed a little bit of light onto some of the comments. So I've been fortunate enough in my career to work as a chunk of it as a tree surgeon for developers and also as a landscaper for developers. So both sides of the coin, and now work for a council. So the key bit that I can see is that the red tape that developers think they're getting away with by removing trees means that they can turn the asset round faster and make their little Gantt chart go green quicker than it goes red, so that they're actually getting the return on investment faster, and it removes the paperwork. So the biodiversity net gain with statute in law that says this is your start point has to be applied with caveat and from the beginning and implemented by councils. If it isn't, they'll just carry on doing that, because the majority of the small developers, not your Taylor Wimpey's, they're 8, 6, 12, 14 developments, and then turn them around as fast as you can. So that's the first observation. The second is why such a large proportion of the trees die, and that's because they're planted by builders into rubble, and it takes an awful lot of skill to actually get a tree to survive with the right protection in the right place, which we all know. And one of the things that we try and do as much as we can is to actually get the right tree in the right place, planted the right way. The third observation, looking at the pictures that are put forward, tree in the right place, most of those trees are way too close, because the understanding of structural soil and how to put trees in roadways across under, with the root masses under driveways going over them, all those sorts of things, isn't fully yet understood, because it's still emerging and developing. And I think we have a job to do to get that information out, to then get the right tree in the right place, planted in the right way, which won't be, because it's between two people's properties and they don't want the sat landing on their cars. So there's a whole pile of things that need to kind of alter, starting with legislation and ending in practice. But this is a great forum for doing that. I just wanted to say that.
But I think I mentioned something similar anyway, that these are indeed the fundamental issues. All the technical issues, they need to be resolved. That's apart from the adoption and the sums and everything else, but they are quite difficult. Yeah.
Thanks for your points, Mark. I was thinking that perhaps you should have been chairing this discussion today. Vasily, you wanted to come in?
Really, just to say, perhaps in answer to Giovanna's question, it sort of relates to where the power lies. So in Bristol, for example, we've got fantastic tree officers who know all this kind of stuff and really would like to do exactly the right thing. Their reports that go to planning committees are really good. They've all got impossible workloads. I don't know how they produce the output they do, but essentially they have very little or no power. And we have an example of a recent, very controversial planning application where the tree officer's reports were suppressed, so they weren't even seen by the planning committee. And we had to get hold of one of them through an FOI, and it took 6 months to get it after the actual planning decision. So I think the issue is how you can change the system so that those people who have access to the kind of information we're seeing here today actually have some power to influence the decision making.
Yeah, just briefly coming back on that, Haringey, the tree department for many years has been very under-resourced, very understaffed. It's only recently got 4 tree officers after 2 being in job in situ for 20 years. So it's astonishingly under-resourced. So we're trying to raise their profile as well. But yeah, I think same in Haringey, the planning team have all the money, the planning and highways teams, and they have all the power as far as we can see. And so it's about shifting that balance to integrate them more, you know, to try to see, for planners to try to see trees as actually really important for their, you know, for all the kind of submission, you know, applications that come in, you know, to start to change the ethos, change the mentality from a kind of bricks and mortar to more, you know, an integrated vision, you know. Yeah.
Thanks, Shobana. We have some very committed planners part of the TDAG network and highway engineers as well. In the interest of time, we've got 8 minutes left. I think I'm going to go to Sean, then to Simon, and then to Sue. So Sean, off you go. Hello, you're on mute, but we can see you.
Lip read.
Sean, you need to unmute. Maybe I can unmute you. Hang on.
Which Sean are you referring to? Because I wasn't aware I had a question.
Ah, Sean, I mean.
No, that's not me.
Well, perhaps let's go to Simon while Sean sorts
Thanks,
his tech
Sean.
trouble off.
Simon Needle, off you go. Oh my goodness, we've not a Simon as well.
Simon.
What about now? You got me now?
Yes.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I don't know. My computer restart earlier. I think it's just played havoc with this. Yeah, I think it was just. I mean, there's been masses going on in the chat, and I can't keep up with all of that. What's going on there? Just as I think something just to say about, you know, the influence that the members of the public can have. I mean, I work as a local authority tree officer in a planning department, so, you know, Giovanna, I work on that side of the fence. But also, I was a co-founder of our local Birmingham Tree People group as well, which have been campaigning and promoting the benefits of urban and local trees. The big thing that we did have was our local groups lobbied the councillors quite a lot, and we made a big difference in terms of our tree policies and strategies. We've now got an urban forest master plan in place. We've now got supplementary. Well, we've altered and amended our planning policies that have been adopted. They've gone through planning inspectorate. We're doing our revision of the local plan. We've put in so much more in there. But as Anna was saying, you know, we've got so many tools to our bow, really, or some of these arrows or strings to our bow. But yeah, resource I think is a real big issue for us. You mentioned you got potentially 4 tree officers now. We've got basically 2 for the entirety of Birmingham, you know, so we're trying to build that resource. So, you know, and you know, we're significantly bigger than some of the London boroughs, and I know they've got huge resource down there, but yeah, it's a really fine balance, I think, on there. But yeah, sometimes there are just things that you just can't account for. But yeah, the members of the public, the members of our groups, lobbying the councillors have been the biggest thing in getting changes and getting them to take account and change policy. After all, they are the people who put those councillors who are making those decisions in power. So.
Thanks, Simon. So shall we just let Tim speak very quickly?
Yeah,
go for it. Go for it, Tim.
Is Tim there?
I'm
here. Got him.
I'm here. Hello everyone, and yeah, sort of a some points really for Irina. Currently there's in Shoebury-Ness in Southend-on-Sea, there's a Taylor Wimpey development about to full planning about to come in. It's had its public exhibition. What's that? Its current plan is to flatten the site at the loss of about 50 cedars, maples, oaks and sycamores. There's a kind of raised embankment with about 40 acer and hawthorn trees on it, all mature. That's going to be flattened. Went to the public exhibition and I witnessed one of Taylor Wimpey representatives when asked by a local resident about whether the embankment was going to be removed. He replied it was going to be reshaped. I intervened to sort of clarify the current scheme proposed to remove and flatten the embankment completely. So I sort of felt that was pretty shoddy use of language and very, very sort of disappointing. Also,
what is the scheme again? What is the site?
It's in the Cantel UK Limited site on Campfield Road, Shoebury-Ness in Essex. And also the
I haven't heard about it, so I haven't heard about that site. Sorry,
right.
but I can't hear about
Sure.
every site.
So I mean, in your examples, it looks like it's going to be one of the poor examples from what I've seen, and it's about 70 houses on this particular site. There is a petition with the council with 160 people supporting a tree preservation order. A temporary one has been put in place to protect the trees. Also, some of the graphics that were used, so there was one showing this sud basin and it looked like something out of Wind in the Willows, you know, and when I interrogated what it will actually look like, it would look like a ditch essentially, and so one of the visual language that's used is very misleading for a proper consultation. That's what I felt. So there are some, and there's sort of also kind of sort of quite empty kind of claims of supporting a range of wildlife, but when you ask what specifically, they could not answer anything at all. So it just seems like it's hopping on the.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay. That's my
basically you've
thoughts
kind of
on a particular.
You've outlined the kind of what often creates the performance gap that is what we're all trying to work hard to close. Thanks very much for
Thanks,
that.
Tim. And I think Irina will be able to
I know who you're talking about.
Anyway, we'll be able to pick that up.
This is not the.
We've got 1 minute to go.
We've got 1 minute to go, Irina. So I'm wondering if you can pick this up offline. Sean left the building and then, well, he left the Zoom room and then came back. Let's just see if we can hear him. Sean, on your iPhone.
Oh yeah.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi about that. Sorry, my phone.
I have to go to another meeting.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I'm so
Thank you very much.
I would love to
my
hear
phone.
this.
Yep. Sean, off you go. Go for your life.
Cool. In brief, cool. So the government have. Oh, okay. Yeah, the government has a plan to provide a lot of affordable housing for the country, and also we have an environmental target and to increase urban greening. And potentially, on first look, these 2 points are contradictory, especially since the cost of greening new urban environments is going to be put onto the consumer, because of was shown today. There is a cost to having more trees, larger trees, maintaining them in the future. So is it actually as contradictory as it seems on first sight?
That was a question or a statement? A question?
Yes, there's a question. Is it as contradictory as it seems on first sight? Is there actually this contradiction between provide affordable housing and also provide good quality housing with a lot of green infrastructure, which is going to increase the price of the housing?
Well, I think serendipitously the best person to answer that question might be an architect. So, Sue, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much. So I was at a DLAP meeting and I was rude enough to mention house builders' profits. So now Irina's left, I can sort of, you know, I mean, there's a whole lot of things to do with the value and cost of housing, which I think needs to be ironed out and probably is beyond the scope of our meeting to do that. But it's a good question to raise, Sean, something that needs to be looked at, because at the end of the proverbial day, we've got these huge challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss, and those things have to be overarching, and we have to find ways of putting that at the forefront of all our decision making. Can I just say quickly that there's a question from Chris Lewis. It's quite a technical one on stop notices. Can you just answer that separately online? It's about examples of local authorities which have successfully applied stop notices. You're on mute. Just do it.
Contact Lichfield Council. I can.
Yeah, there we are. That's yeah. Chris hasn't got a microphone. Does
we wrap up, Sue?
Yeah, I think we need to wrap up now. So basically, I've got a checklist here of things that need to happen. Big issue: local authority resources, education for architects, et al. BS 5837, it is due for being renewed, but we don't know exactly when it's going to be updated. Land value we've discussed, and the whole question of commuted sums. So we are working on a national commuted sums guidance. We're working on tree cost guidance, and we're working on the need for a national underground design code. So it's a kind of watch this space, things may emerge.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Sean. And thanks for connecting and reconnecting just so you could speak. So we've gone over past 4. I think we should wrap up the meeting for today. I want to thank our excellent presenters. I want to thank Anne, Vasily and Irina, but she's left to go for another meeting, which is sad. Thank you to everybody who came today and for all the stuff that you threw into the chat. This is how TDAG works. We are a forum for collaborative discussion, and we are quite small in number. So if anybody wants to chip in with ideas or documents or help, then just please get in touch with myself or Sue.